Welcome, everyone. As many of you know, I'm Marcia Marley, President and Executive Director of Succeed Together, the parent organization of the Literary Festival. It has been a very sad and extremely painful week. There is much that needs to be changed in our country if our ideals of equality and justice are to be realized for everyone. This change happens at many different levels and in many different ways. We at Succeed Together are committed to leveling the playing field by working to close the opportunity achievement gap, one child at a time. We thank you for your support of this effort tonight. Your tickets will help fund Succeed Together's free online summer program, including classes in math, algebra, writing, poetry, Mandarin, coding, violin, to name only a few. Please consider giving an additional donation to fund our summer program by clicking the donate button at the bottom of your screen, the one in teal green. Much appreciated. None of our events or programs would be possible without our generous literary festival sponsors, volunteers, and staff. It is my pleasure to introduce Festival Director, as well as Succeed Together's Program Director, Jackie Morass. Jackie?
Thank you. Thank you for joining us this evening. We have some great festival events coming up, including Maria Russo, author of How to Raise a Reader, on June 17th, and film director and author John Sayles will be in conversation with actor and former Montclair resident Joe Morton on June 25th. Tonight's book, Circe, is available for purchase through Watch on Booksellers. The link is in the chat to your right. If you have a question, you can click on the Ask a Question bar on the bottom right of your screen. We're thrilled today to welcome book editor Lee Boudreaux and Madeline Miller, author of Circe, one of my favorite books of the year. Lee Boudreaux is an executive editor at Doubleday, where she publishes a fiction list devoted to unusual stories, unexpected voices, and a strong sense of place. In addition to Circe, some of the books she has edited are Madeline Miller's New York Times bestseller, The Song of Achilles, Andrew Sean Greer's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Alas, Curtis Sittenfeld's Prep, Kevin Wilson's The Family Fang, and Claire Lombardo's The Most Fun We Ever Had. She moved with her husband and daughter to Montclair in 2018. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here. I was a happy audience member last year at the festival and saw so many wonderful authors and enjoyed attending with my daughter and my husband. And I'm thrilled to be part of it this year. And I'm especially thrilled to be talking to Madeline Miller, whose 2 books I have had the great good fortune to publish. Hello, Madeline.
Hello, Lee.
So I'm just going to tell folks a little bit about where you were in the year 2012, where you had been teaching Latin and Greek and Shakespeare to high school students for several years. And that's the year that you published your debut novel, The Song of Achilles. It appeared on the New York Times extended bestseller list. It came out to great critical acclaim. The Washington Post said you were deepening and enriching a tale that had been told for 3,000 years. O Magazine called you spellbinding. Donna Tartt praised your work for having the true savagery and chill of antiquity, which is a quote I have always loved. USA called it a remarkable achievement, and you finished out 2012 winning the Orange Prize for Fiction in the UK. And I believe, if I am remembering this correctly, J.K. Rowling gave an interview, didn't she, where she said this was her favorite book of the year, even though you and I never got to use that quote on a book. But yes, I'm remembering that correctly.
Yes.
So you left school teaching behind for a moment, and in 2018 we published Circe together, a book Anne Patchett called an epic spanning thousands of years that's also a keep you up all night page turner. It debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and was named a best book of the year by NPR, The Washington Post, People, Time, Entertainment Weekly, and so many others. And it is just now out in paperback after an extraordinary 2-year run in hardcover. And I know we're going to kick this off tonight with that wonderful excerpt about why men make such terrible pigs.
Sure. Just before I say that, I want to say what a treat it is to be here, to be part of the festival, and to be talking to Lee. It is not very often that, an author gets to talk to their beloved editor who really kind of made it all happen. So being here with Lee is really, really special for me. And I can still remember the very first phone call I had with her when, before she was officially my editor. And I was so nervous to talk to her. And my wonderful agent, Julie Bear, said, just don't be weird. You're going to be fine. And so I tamped my weirdness way down. And Lee and I had an amazing conversation. And before that point, I had really wondered, how do I know if someone's going to be the right editor for Song of Achilles? Because this was my baby I'd worked on for 10 years. And as soon as I talked to Lee, I knew that Lee just had that perfect ability to bring out the very best in a book and the very best in my work. And so, working with you has been such a great pleasure of my life. So I just wanted to say that first.
Tamp down the weirdness because I was that close to suggesting that we both wear our Medusa hats to do on this new town of mine. So I'm very glad we're both it in for each other.
So I will now read a passage. I will now read a passage from Circe. Circe is the daughter of the sun god Helios. She's most infamous in Greek mythology for turning Odysseus's men into pigs. She is both a goddess and a witch, the first witch in what gets called Western literature. And in this passage, she has already started turning men into pigs. And the he in this passage is Odysseus. He asked me once, why pigs? We were seated before my hearth in our usual chairs. He liked the one draped in cowhide, with silver inlaid in its carvings. Sometimes he would rub the scrolling absently beneath his thumb. Why not? I said. He gave me a bare smile. I mean it. I would like to know. I knew he meant it. He was not a pious man, but the seeking out of things hidden. This was his highest worship. There were answers in me. I felt them, buried deep as last year's bulbs growing fat. Their roots tangled with those moments I had spent against the wall. And my lions were gone, and my spells shut up inside me. After I changed a crew, I would watch them, scrabbling and crying in the sty, falling over each other, stupid with their horror. They hated it all. Their newly voluptuous flesh, their delicate split trotters, their swollen bellies dragging in the earth's muck. It was a humiliation, a debasement. They were sick with longing for their hands, those appendages men use to mitigate the world. Come, I would say to them, it's not that bad. You should appreciate a pig's advantages. Mud slick and swift, they are hard to catch. Low to the ground, they cannot easily be knocked over. They are not like dogs. They do not need your love. They can thrive anywhere, on anything, scraps and trash. They look witless and dull, which lulls their enemies, but they are clever. They will remember your face. They never listened. The truth is, men make terrible pigs.
Now, you have said the Song of Achilles, and I remember this, was 10 years in the making. When did you know you were going to write about Circe? And I know the Iliad was the touchstone. Your mother read it to you as a child. So when did she take form in your mind? And what did you know about her as she was first appearing to you?
Well, actually, Lee, you were a key part of this, because when I was working on Song of Achilles was like just blocked out absolutely everything else. I couldn't see anything beyond it. The whole world was Achilles and Patroclus. But when it was over and, we had kind of gone through the final edits, we were moving into the blurb phase. I remember you and I had a phone conversation and you said, well, what's next? And I think I said, flatline. And I got off the phone with you and I thought, oh my gosh, I guess I'm going to write another book. And then it was sort of immediately, there was Circe. And so my first memory of Circe, and the reason that I knew, so thank you for asking that question, Lee. Because otherwise,
at the end of this,
another Achilles and Patroclus novel. So, but Circe was actually a character that had been with me for a while. And so looking back on it, it really makes sense that I wanted to write about her and that she had kind of been waiting in the wings, even though I didn't know she was waiting in the wings. Because it really goes back to when I was 13 years old. And I had loved Greek mythology before that. My mom used to read me little pieces of it. I read everything I could find. I had good old Dolaire's, that huge book of Greek myths. But in 8th grade, we finally, in English class, all read the Odyssey together, and it was the first time I had my own copy of the Odyssey. And I knew that there was this witch who turned men into pigs, and I was really excited for her section because I thought, that sounds like a great character, particularly because, as many of you may know, the female characters in Greek myth are often pretty eclipsed, they're pretty flat, oftentimes they're just names. Oftentimes they die only to motivate the male hero's story, and they're not really given a full story themselves. And if they do wield power or show any kind of independence, oftentimes they have to be punished for that by the end of their story. So I was really interested in Circe because she does wield a fair amount of power, but she isn't punished for it by the end of her story. And she and Odysseus, have this really interesting interaction where she's turned his men into pigs. She's obviously very complicated. She's very clever. He's very clever. This is going to be a great scene. That's what I was telling myself as a 13-year-old. But the scene in the Odyssey is extremely unsatisfying. Spoiler. What actually happens is that Odysseus goes to confront her because she's turned his men into pigs, and he pulls his sword on her and he threatens her. And she immediately screams and falls to her knees and begs for mercy and invites him into her bed in basically one speech. And I was completely outraged, as only a 13-year-old can be. I was so angry. I thought, how, that's it? That's all she gets? Just this brief little moment, and then she literally has to be on her knees in front of the male hero. And, the phallic sword did not escape my notice at the time. And I didn't know that impulse, that feeling of, let's just keep the camera on Circe a little bit longer, would eventually lead to this novel, but I think it really did. And then, of course, I ended up getting my master's in classics also, and so I returned to Circe many more times as an older and hopefully more mature student. And what I saw as I got older was the fact that I felt that aside from the fact that she didn't get very much stage time, that she had been really unfairly villainized by later versions of her. So in Homer, although she and Odysseus have this initial conflict, they do eventually become lovers, and she ends up helping him. She offers him and his men a place to stay for a year. She gives him all this advice about how to get past the monster. She's the one who says, Odysseus, put beeswax in your men's ears so they won't hear the siren song. And when you kind of look at her episode in total, you realize she's one of the most helpful characters that he encounters, despite the whole pig thing. But when she is treated, when later writers talk about her, other than Homer, they treat her just pretty much as a straight up villain. I mean, she is the man-hater, she's the seductress, she's the spider at the center of the web, luring men in. She's just seen as sort of this incarnation of all the fear about what happens when women get power. So I kind of wanted to do two things. One, I wanted to give her a voice, but I also wanted to make sure that voice had a full complexity, that it had, both, yes, she's frightening, but she's also benevolent and healing and wise, and, her witchcraft also was a huge piece of that. So that is a very long answer, but that is why I had always been drawn to Circe.
She is an extraordinary and complicated character. Did you always know it would be in first person, not only her story? I loved what you said about Odysseus would be a cameo in her story, the way she was a cameo in the Odyssey. That was also part of what you knew about the fabric of the book as you put it together. Where do you let research leave off, and where do you begin to embroider it? And how much did you know about Circe? You obviously used the Odyssey in that one scene. Were there other sources you could go to think, to fully imagine what else you needed to imagine about Circe? Because this was, you're telling the extraordinary arc of her life from the time that she is born and is a young girl and sort of stays at her father's feet, and her first love and the sort of shattering conclusion of that, her exile, all the way through motherhood, the many mortals she knows, to the end. So there was a lot of canvas you had to cover. What did you use to fully inform that, and how much did you just have to leap off the imaginative cliff and do it yourself?
So this was one of the things that was a little bit different from Song of Achilles, because with Song of Achilles, there are so many myths about Achilles out there that the problem is you can't possibly include them all, because they're overlapping and contradictory. But with Circe, there was a lot more space. And I actually really liked that. I liked the fact that I was going to get to tell sort of, sew a few episodes together and really kind of construct this life out of just little mentions and little bits. So there were 4 major sources that I used. One was the Odyssey. I also used Ovid. Ovid has a love story between Circe and Glaucus, who's a god who used to be immortal, and a nymph whose name I will not say because it is a little bit of a spoiler for the novel. I also used a meeting from the Argonautica, which is an ancient work about Jason and the Argonauts, where she meets Medea. She is Medea's aunt, and I thought, wow, Medea, the other great witch from ancient literature, definitely want to put that episode in. And then there was an epic that has been lost, but we have in summary, called the Telegony, that references a child of Circe's, and eventually has Circe and Penelope, Odysseus's wife, meet. And so I knew, again, I wanted to do that, again, these 2 complex, really interesting women. So those were kind of the pillars. And
those 2 characters would meet, but you didn't know anything else about how that turned out. That's all you?
That's all me. So everything, yeah. So everything sort of in between, and I looked for opportunities. If you've read the novel, you know that in the beginning, that's not you, Lee, if you've read the novel. I know you've read it. That's for others. If you've read the novel, Prometheus shows up fairly early on, and Circe has a really formative conversation with Prometheus and interaction with him. Now, there is no myth where Circe meets Prometheus that we have in ancient literature. However, Circe's grandfather, Oceanus, and her father, Helios, are 2 of the other great titans, along with Prometheus. And they play a significant role in Prometheus's story in the ancient world. And so I thought, well, I have an opportunity here. She is not officially part of Prometheus's story, but her father and her grandfather are. And this was sort of the big thing that happened among the titans. And so as a daughter of titans, she would have an opportunity, a space there to be involved. So I looked for things like that, where I could bring Circe into the mythology in a way that made sense. But I didn't use everything. There was an Ovid story about Circe turning this guy into a woodpecker. I was not interested, so left that out.
You have to do that in the editing. You were just like, woodpecker. We're not going to.
Yeah, cut that out. But you asked me about Circe as a first-person narrative. And I wanted to address that too, because one of the things that is really notable in the Odyssey is that most of the Odyssey is narrated by the poet, whoever that is, Homer or the rhapsode who's speaking. But the Circe episode is narrated by Odysseus himself. And as soon as I started thinking about that, I felt like I was almost being invited to retell the story from Circe's perspective, because Odysseus, of course, is the great liar of ancient literature. He lies his way across the Mediterranean in the Odyssey. He's constantly manipulating and, shifting and spinning things all throughout. And so I thought, why are we trusting him to tell the truth? Certainly, once you look at the Circe episode from that light, you start to realize that the way Odysseus is telling it is, so there was this terrifying witch, and she totally got the jump on my men, but then I came and I tamed her, and then she threw herself at me, and she was super hot. So that's Odysseus's version of the Circe episode, which, when you think of it that way, sounds really self-aggrandizing and is definitely designed to impress the people that he's staying with and make him look good. And every time he talks about how mysterious and beautiful Circe is, what he's really saying is, look how amazing I am, that I was with this goddess. And I thought, this is why it's really important for it to be Circe's voice who's speaking, because I feel like she has to be able to push back against 3,000 years of Odysseus standing in the center of the stage.
Right. I'm going to ask you a question about the obstacles sometimes of writing a book and figuring out the sort of very hard to figure out part. So we're going to do this. There are two sections to it. One is to talk about the moment you understood you were telling the Song of Achilles and Circe, whether it was in the lyrical voice or the epic voice, because I feel that was part of your working out how the Song of Achilles worked, was to get that right.
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk a little bit about how much fun it was for me, not for you. The end of this novel, where you had a character who was immortal. So what's going to happen to her? And B, was grounded. She'd been exiled and she was sent to her room. And what were we going to do with that? Because this was one of the most fun editing jobs I've ever had, where the narrative propulsion going when you had these two things, these two kind of pillars just out of view that were like, she can't die and she can't leave her room. How are we doing that? Miracle. And then all the clever ways you figured out how to, like all good kids who are being grounded, you figured out how to get her out of her room every now and then.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Lee, for not running screaming from the novel when you realized that those were the two key pieces, and for helping me figure out, how to make that work. So start with that, or start with, wait, you had another really good question before that.
We're just letting it all hang out here.
We're letting it all hang out. Okay, wonderful. By the way, I don't know if people can hear, but all of a sudden there was a terrible storm here earlier and it's come back and the rain is like pelting. So I apologize if you can hear that. Hopefully you can't, but anyway, we're gonna hope the power stays on. So I knew that the part of what I wanted to do was to really set Circe at the center of this epic story. And as you said, with Song of Achilles, I felt like what I was doing was telling an epic story from this really intimate, personal, lyric perspective. So I was taking the epic story of Achilles and the Iliad and the great warrior and telling it from the perspective of his lover and all these intimate moments between them, and this other very human side of him. But with Circe, I kind of wanted to go in the other direction, because traditionally women have been really kept out of epic. Their stories have been seen as not important enough for epic. Epic was the great marquee genre of the ancient world. And so therefore it was about, for the most part, traditionally male things like war and vengeance and patrimony and all that, big journeys, things that were traditionally male. And so I wanted to use some of that epic tone and epic diction and sort of epic feel with Circe. But as you say, she spends a lot of time in the novel gardening. She spends a lot of time with her cat, her giant lion. She spends a lot of time, I didn't have a cat when I wrote Circe. She spends a lot of time doing things that are quieter, doing witchcraft, which is sort of her art. And part of what I think I was really looking for in those sections is I wanted to give them their full epic weight. I wanted to say, yes, in some ways these things are maybe not as exciting as facing monsters, although there was plenty of facing monsters as well in the novel, but they are really significant and valuable parts of Cersei's life, and they deserve their place. And so part of what I really wanted to say was, you know, a woman's life, and that's really what Cersei is. It's the story of a woman coming of age, finding her voice and finding her place in a world that is really hostile to her having that place. And that her life and her developing that is plot enough. And I really appreciate you supporting that the whole way. You know, that a lot of the plot in some of the middle chapters is really Cersei, you know, coming to terms with things.
Well, we have to talk about her power and her witchcraft, because it's interesting. You're saying there you were trying to write it in an epic tone, and yet when she's sent to the island, when she's sent to Aiaya at first, and you did something so brilliant. We were expecting her to be just sort of brought to her knees, and then we watch her rebuild from that. But instead, her father, the Titan, has decided to thumb his nose at Zeus and say, you may be able to exile us, but we can do exile better than most of you could dream of. And so she's put on, and she is able to begin. She's alone, but this works for her. She has been surrounded by thousands of cousins and aunts and uncles and gods showing off constantly her whole life. And as I heard you say once, nymphs, which is what she's a minor goddess, she's a nymph. They are usually either pawns or prey. So when she gets a room of her own, it's meant to be a punishment, but instead it is the wellspring of her power. But her power is not at all a godlike power. It is not thunderbolts and instant vengeance and instant gratification. It is this slow process of learning and earning it. And it takes her so long to figure out the spells and the herbs and the roots and the way to do it and when to do it. And she builds this power, and it is such a hard won, again, a thing she learned. She was not just given it. And I loved it. It was thrilling. The first time, what does she do? The first time it works, it's an acorn or something, and it pops into a strawberry. It was so exciting when it was thrilling to watch this woman come into her own. And the whole time I was reading it, I was getting such a satisfied chuckle, because I kept thinking, I feel like Madeline is talking about two things. She is talking about the act of writing, that it is, I mean, just perspiration and the tiniest bit of inspiration, and it doesn't work, and it's all dreck for the longest time, and then finally teeny little fizzle of magic, and you use that to go on. And the other thing I thought you were talking about was motherhood, because it is exhausting. She does the most quotidian, repetitive, grinding tasks day after day when she has a child and she realizes she has to protect him, to kind of keep this spell above him. So I thought Cersei's power was remarkable to read about, because it was nothing like we expected from the gods. And you showed how much work went into every bit of what she was able to do.
Well, that was really sort of, when I initially started writing about Cersei, the fact that she was a witch was almost a little intimidating to me. I had always appreciated the role that sort of witches played in, you know, feminist history, and how often calling a woman a witch was related to misogyny, and you know, so I had been interested in the history of the witch culturally, but I was a little bit, you know, I had not really been drawn to ancient witchcraft that much. And as I started to work on it, what I realized is this is an art. This is a metaphor for any sort of creative endeavor. Writing, as you said, those sections of Cersei discovering her magic, I did not intend them to be a description of my writing process. They definitely are. But that part of what why I find her so compelling is that I see her as an artist. And that just like Virginia Woolf with a room of her own, when she finally has an island of her own, when she has this space where she can allow herself to create, she is able to just do extraordinary things. But those extraordinary things come out of not divine power, as you say, but hard work and passion and skill and dedication and showing up. And to me, most of the gods are really horrendous parents. And I sort of connect Cersei's ability to be a better parent than most gods to to her child with her ability to do that kind of tedious, hard work. And to just keep showing up and keep trying again, even when you make mistakes. I think that that is a really a quality that I admired so much in her. And as I was thinking about sort of her witchcraft and how she is different from most gods, I'm sort of always going back to the original material, and I'm a little bit like I sort of sift through it, and I'm looking for like the little flecks of gold, trying to find, what are the things that resonate with me. And I connected it to this kind of throwaway comment in the Odyssey, where Circe is described as the dread goddess who speaks like a human. And it's a very mysterious description in the Odyssey. It's been debated by scholars. No one really knows exactly what it means. But to me, as a novelist, I immediately thought, well, she understands how to live as a human. She's born a goddess, but there's some piece of her that really resonates with the way humans live. And that type of hard work and passionate dedication, that is how humans excel. And that is how Circe excels too. So it also kind of, combined with her connection to humanity, her artistry is part of her connection to the human world too.
And I always loved her affinity for mortals. She was always an outsider. And you have that beautiful quote that she repeats several times. The way she realizes early on that she is sort of swimming through the murk of her world, and she's not of it. She's a creature sort of moving through it. And she always has this affinity for mortals, starting with the fact that when her father, the sun god, is late, the astronomers are put to death on Earth. And this, of course, is a source of hilarity to the gods if they even bother to think about it at all. I mean, they could not care less what happens to the mortals who are even there sort of serving them or worshiping them. And Circe is greatly troubled by the fact that perfectly innocent people will be punished for something her father does if he wants to go visit his cows for a little longer than expected. It's something she shares with Prometheus, but we see it repeat over and over in her life with Daedalus, with Odysseus, later on in the grand descent, where her immortality separating her from people she loves is going to be a cause of great sadness to her. So was that the affinity for mortals? Was that always part of the Circe story in any way, or did you bring that in yourself and create the parallels with Prometheus and others?
I think I was drawing on it a little bit from that Homer description about her being able to speak like a human. I was also looking at the fact that she is so helpful to Odysseus, and I thought, well, that's really interesting. She clearly is drawn to Odysseus in that moment, and in fact, when Odysseus when it comes time for him to leave, he doesn't want to go. His men have to prod him, which is really an extraordinary moment, because Odysseus spends the whole Odyssey agitating to get home, constantly saying, let's go, let's go, let's go. I want to get back to Ithaca, except for when he's on Circe's island. And so that was something that I thought, well, that's very interesting. She clearly has sort of an ability to relate to humanity. But also it was actually this reference in Ovid that I was interested in too. Ovid describes Circe as having an ingenium, an inborn temperament more fitted for love than other gods. And that immediately, I couldn't write this paper as an academic, but as a novelist, immediately her ability to love and her ability to speak like a human, those were the same to me as a novelist. And so what I started to say with Circe is that this is a goddess who can feel empathy, which Lee is a big mythology buff, so she knows this well. The ancient Greek gods are horrendous. In the stories, they are cruel and petty and capricious and just nasty and vengeful. And if you make them angry, they'll punish you and your children and your children's children. It doesn't matter if it was totally an accident, whatever you did to them, they are still going to come after you. And basically, I came to feel that what the gods are sociopathic narcissists. So what would it be like to be born in a family of sociopathic narcissists, but not want to live that way, but feel great empathy and a great desire to connect to other people? And so that initial meeting with Prometheus, And Prometheus is the god who brought fire and civilization to mankind. So he's one of the very few gods who seems to genuinely care about humanity as opposed to himself. Is the first moment where she meets another god who has that kind of empathy.
Yeah. I'm seeing some excellent questions there in the margin. I'm going to get to those in a few minutes. I want to spend a little bit of time on gods and monsters, because I want to thank you for letting me be a grown-up who gets paid for saying things like, don't you think we should have more pages about Scylla and her many heads coming out to snap up the sailors that go by? She is so tormented by the fact that so many mortals will be fed into this maw that for various reasons she feels responsible for. Scylla is one of the most fun parts of the book to read, but I've also heard you talk about Trigon and where you came up with that, which was, again, just such a fun scene to read. I could read it over and over and over again. Until I was listening to you talk in another venue, that is one of the first scenes that ever came to you, that you knew that was going to be a part of the book. So tell us a little bit about that and the way you try to obey the internal logic of the book, even though you are writing about gods and monsters and superhuman strengths, because you require yourself to keep it within the realm of the believable, even as you are doing such extraordinary things.
Yes. Well, for me, I mean, first of all, I feel like I'm the luckiest person alive, that I get to write about this mythology. I get to write, here I am, a classicist who studied classics my whole life, and then I get to write a Minotaur C-section scene. So that feels like pretty apex in terms of good fortune, and have an editor who doesn't immediately cut it and who helps me write that scene to be even more. So I really feel that for me, my interest in the myths is actually the psychological side. And I love the psychology of them. And in the original Iliad, psychology is, I would argue, implied, but it's never spelled out. We never get the sort of Hamlet soliloquy of any of these characters. And so part of what I wanted to do was really take these myths, but put the focus on the psychological side of it. How do these, if the character in mythology does these three things, how do these things make sense for this character? Why do they do them? Why does Circe turn men into pigs? That's something that's not even addressed in the original. And, felt like a huge omission in my mind, because it's really a pretty extreme thing to do. So I'm always thinking psychologically, and I really want, as you say, those scenes with the monsters to be grounded in real human stakes and in real in realism. And so when she has, turned she's done something horrible to a nymph and turned them into a monster, yes, you get all the wonderful scenes with her turning into a monster, but then you have to deal with the fact that Circe has to live with the fact that she's done this, and that monster is then going to go kill people, and those deaths are on her head, and there is nothing she can do to escape that. And that's where the emphasis is. And I think, keeping it on those things. And the Trigon was completely made up by me. There's a reference in the ancient mythology to Circe arming her son with a stingray tail spear to protect him. And I fell in love with that detail. I just, like, fireworks were going off in my brain when I read that. I thought, oh my gosh, a stingray tail, what an incredible weapon. That's so weird. It's so unusual. And so immediately my brain started spiraling into, this can't just be a regular stingray. This has to be like the Lord of all stingrays at the bottom of the ocean. And Circe has to go down. So, and I didn't really know where that scene was going to go. I just knew that had to happen, and that character of the Lord of all stingrays, this ancient god who lies at the bottom of the ocean with this incredibly powerful tail, had to be part of the story. And I think then it was just a matter of, that hung out in the back of my mind, and I told this story of Circe's psychological growth, and then all of a sudden there it was. Here's the moment where it belongs. And as it turned out, it was a really vital moment to the story. It becomes this sort of transformative moment for Circe, where she transforms in her own way. So I think always keeping an eye on the stakes, in that Minotaur C-section scene that I wrote, that is a scene about a terrifying and monstrous birth experience, which is something that, hopefully none of us have had quite that terrifying birth experience. But, I feel like it does resonate. Like basically what epic does is it just blows up human experiences a little bit bigger so we can really see them well. So, that idea of a really scary thing about like, what am I giving birth to? What's happening? There's blood everywhere. Those can be really intense moments. And then you just blow it up a little bit bigger. And that's epic. But again, that sort of moment was really about her relationship with her sister. And, that was where, even though there was this monster involved, that was the core of the scene.
And I've heard you say that it's interesting if Trigon and what she had to retrieve from him, it comes very late in the book for something that you knew needed to happen from the minute you kind of conceived of this novel. You didn't get to play that card early. It comes quite late and performs a really vital service in the larger arc of the story. And I heard you say that for an epic hero, usually they have to make a journey. It's often to the underworld. And that just didn't make sense in Cersei's story. But when you began to formulate this Trigon scene, you realized that was what she was going to have to confront. That was the deep, dark, unknown place where she had to go to sort of bring back the thing she needed to survive on the earth.
Exactly. Yeah, that I really wanted, I never want to be shoehorning in those epic things, but, as someone who has studied epic literature my whole life, the journey to the underworld, the reckoning, where Odysseus has to speak to he learns for the first time that his mother is dead because he goes to speak to the shades of the underworld, and he has a confrontation with Achilles, and he has to speak to a prophet to get advice to go forward. That it's sort of that passage into the underworld is like a portal you have to go through. You see it very clearly in Virgil's Aeneid as well. Aeneas has to go down to the underworld and speak to his father before he can move on to Italy and found the Roman people. And so those are all their portals that the characters have to pass through. And I didn't, now I can sort of say, well, that's what that scene was. But all this stuff is happening kind of under the covers in my brain, and that it gets revealed as I go. And so part of what I've learned to do is just trust my instincts. That, not every instinct is right, but that if there's something that keeps sticking with me, that there's a reason for it, and that I will find that resonance when it comes. And in a way, Song of Achilles was wonderful practice for that, because the Iliad is basically the last quarter of the Song of Achilles. And so most of what I was writing up to the Iliad. And so all those great scenes from the Iliad that I loved were just, there, keep writing, you're not there yet, keep going, you're not there yet. And, I came to really appreciate telling that backstory. And so I really like having, scenes kind of waiting for me at the end. It's like a wonderful carrot that I'm writing towards. And oftentimes my big problem is not knowing how the book will end, but how the book will begin. That's my, my big struggle.
Well, and I'm not going to give anything away, but I do want to talk about the ending before we get to the questions, just to say, did you know how this would end when you started it? Because I remember reading it for the first time and just thinking, what is she going to do? What is she going to do? How is she make me okay with what's going to happen here? I don't know about this. And then, oh my God, that ending, it sends shivers up my spine. So did you know what Cersei does at the end? Did you know how she, what path she took? Did you know who was home at Aiaia when she was making decisions? What did you know about where the players would be on the chessboard? And what came to you as you spent years getting to know Cersei and writing her story?
So I always knew that I wanted to change what the myth was that exists currently about Circe's ending. And again, we don't have the full epic version of this. We just have a reference to it. Most of the ancient epics have been lost. The Iliad and the Odyssey were only two of many, many other epics. So this one has been lost, but as I said, we have a summary. And so I'll tell what the summary is so I can kind of talk about the ending that way. So this is what I didn't do. So it's not a spoiler. What I didn't do was have Circe make Penelope, her son Telegonus, and Penelope's son with Odysseus, Telemachus, I'm sorry, their names are Telegonus and Telemachus, make them all gods. And I just thought, no. And not only are they all gods, but Circe marries Telemachus and Penelope marries Telegonus. So they like swap sons, which is very strange to me. So I knew that was not happening either. And I had this really strong feeling that Telegonus, Circe's son, was not straight. So he was not interested in getting married to Penelope. And luckily there was an alternate myth. So he went off to Italy to pursue his alternate myth. And I knew that I didn't want Penelope's story to end in marriage because I felt like there's this constant talk in the Odyssey about what man Penelope is attached to and sort of what man she's going to be with. And I wanted the focus with Penelope to be on herself at the end, but I didn't know what was going to happen with that. So there's a big question mark about what happened with Penelope not marrying Telegonus, but I didn't know what would happen. And then in terms of Circe and Telemachus, I really didn't know whether or not they were going to get together. I left that open. I thought, well, I'll see where you guys are. I'll see what happens when you get there. You're going to have to talk me into it if you're interested in that characters, because I never want to be kind of shoehorning characters together. But when they got there, they were able to talk to each other and sort of find things that were similar, that really connected in a very deep way. They both have incredibly difficult fathers. They are both looking to live a very different life than the life that was laid out for them when they were born. They are both really interested in crafts and working with their hands. And most of all, who is the main influence in Telemachus's life? It's Penelope. And, I thought he would be a very interesting young man if you've been raised by Penelope. So those were all things that I was thinking about, but most of all, I was thinking about that line about Circe being the goddess who speaks like a human. And sometimes those characters who straddle two worlds have to find a way to bridge those worlds. But I felt, oh my gosh, that's my cat. I'm so sorry. There she is. Lee, we talked about this. We talked about whether or not we were going to get cat bombed, and it happened.
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. But I felt that in Circe's case, she was not attempting to put those two worlds together because who wants to be in the world of the gods? I felt that she was instead trying to move from one world to another. So I knew there were a lot of question marks about the ending, but I knew kind of the basic arc. And then I wanted to see what happened as the character went through.
Yeah. I'm going to look up at some of the questions here, and I encourage you guys to write in. There was one earlier on that I definitely wanted to touch on, which is, do you see Circe as a feminist, and in what way did you need to sort of bring her to the current moment? And I will say, as we were publishing Circe, having published Song of Achilles too, I always sort of knew in the back of my mind, I was like, wow, I think it's going to be really fun to publish Circe. We have this female protagonist, and it's taken from the Odyssey, which I feel like if there's going to be one you're assigned in 8th grade, it is more likely to be the Odyssey. And then there's a certain percentage of people who drop off and don't get around to reading the Iliad. So I thought, oh, this is going to be good for all these reasons. And then I heard you get up and talk about it. And it was right as sort of the Me Too moment was beginning to happen. And you talked about writing your book and listening to the news with one ear and realizing that here we were going to get the story told from the woman's point of view when she had never been able to tell her own story. It was entirely overlaid with the man's version of it. And it felt to me at that moment like, 2 years ago, Circe was a book that that met its moment in a way that none of us could have predicted or orchestrated or arranged to have happen. It was a book that spoke to a lot of us at the moment it appeared on the scene. How mindful of you as you were creating Circe, of living in 2018 and what was happening in the world at that moment?
I mean, for me, it was really amazing to see that happen, because as you know, the book was basically written when all that was happening. And so I had gone into this, I don't know if I didn't used to admit this, but now I admit it, which is that both of my novels were completely fueled by rage, and that I came to them out of this real deep anger, anger at sort of the marginalizing and silencing of women in classics, and frustration that, Circe hasn't had a chance to tell her story, and sort of the sexist elements of her story, and how, silent she's been. And so from the beginning, it was a feminist project for me. I wanted it to be the story of this woman who was really struggling to be taken seriously, be respected, have independence, have agency in her life. And so I never feel that I have to bring in sort of modern things. I feel like all I have to do is open up the myths and hold them out. And I feel like that connection is still there. I mean, technology has changed and some cultural things have changed, but so much has not changed. I mean, we are still us. It's startling. Once you start reading the ancient works, you realize how shockingly fresh and modern they are. We were just talking about this yesterday, Lee. The Iliad kicks off with a pandemic. Nothing new under the sun, the ancients said, and I think that's absolutely right. And there's so many stories of women from the ancient world that are just absolutely take your breath away resonant. There's a story of this woman who her sister marries a king, and the king ends up kidnapping her and raping her, and she says, "I know that I'm the one who's going to be blamed for this, and people are going to shame me, but I'm still going to tell everybody what you did." Her name is Philomela. And he says, "Well, if you're going to threaten me with that, I'm going to cut out your tongue." And he cuts out her tongue so she can't tell anybody. And then she weaves the story of what happened to her, the rape, into a tapestry. And she sends it to her sister. So her sister is able to look at the tapestry and understand what has happened. And just that intense desire for women to say, "I know what this is going to bring on me, but I am going to speak anyway." And the incredible cost that women have had to pay, the price women have had to pay to speak up. So all that, I don't have to add anything to that story. It's all there. It's right there. So I feel like, I'm not bringing in modern things. I'm just sort of opening them.
Yeah. Looking at another question, Circe and Calypso. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between those two characters?
Sure. So Calypso is very interesting, and actually people get them confused a lot, understandably, because Calypso also seems to sort of have a magical island. She and Odysseus are also lovers. She also her name begins with a C, or a kappa in Greek. And so people often kind of put them together. And I absolutely think that Calypso could make a wonderful novel in her own right. The main difference between Circe and Calypso is that Circe, when Odysseus comes to her and says it's time to leave, she says, "Great, go ahead. Here's what you need. Bye." When Odysseus wants to leave for Calypso, Calypso ends up holding him prisoner against his will for 7 years. And actually the gods have to come down, Hermes has to come down and say to Calypso, "Okay, it's time to let Odysseus go." And she delivers this amazing sort of rebuke to Hermes, where she says, "You male gods get to do whatever you want with mortals. This is a total double standard that you don't let me do this with him just because I'm female." And so I love that there's this feminist aspect between Circe and Calypso that sort of is similar too. I feel like there's sort of this undercurrent of feminism with both of them that's there even in the original. But the other way that they're different is that Circe to me actually feels a little bit outside of the typical Greek world in a way that Calypso doesn't. And I believe in this I'm not alone, many scholars have talked about this, that Circe is actually was created drawing on inspiration from Eastern goddesses. Goddesses like Ishtar and Cybele, the Great Mother, goddesses who are creators and destroyers, who are associated with lions and birds of prey, who are often called Patnia Theron, the mistress of the beasts. And that Circe really comes out of that tradition. She was later associated with Rome, and sort of her island was put over there, but Homer tells us that she's near the dancing grounds of dawn, which means she's in the east. And so that was something that was really, I think that's a little bit of a difference between Circe and Calypso, is that, you know, when you're looking at the Odyssey, you can read the Circe episode many ways. It's sort of about man taming a woman, but it's also, is this also about West taming East? You know, there's a lot of resonances there. So I think there's some real similarities. Probably Calypso and Circe would have a lot to talk about if they met, but I think there are also some differences too. Is she there?
We have a very, very important, which brings us to discussing the incredible tension in your household that you are married to a scholar, who's won on the cat name front.
It's true. It's true.
Talk a little bit about right next. Are you staying with the Greek classics? Are you going to Norse? We're going to roll it up with Shakespeare next. What are we going to do, Madeline?
All right, so I'm going to type the cat's name because people, it's hard for people to say it. Her name is Sif, which is the sort of Norse goddess of spring and fertility. She's also Thor's wife, but she's known as Sif of the long golden hair. And my cat is a Siberian, so she has very long hair. So that seemed appropriate. But yes, now we have two Norse names. So definitely the balance is tilting. We're going to have to bring it back for the next animal. But I'm not going to write about the Norse myths because I don't read Old Norse, and I would feel like I definitely had to before I could tackle that. That so much of my inspiration comes from really being with the language at a granular level. So I'm going to leave that to my husband and to people who can read Old Norse. But I am going to write about Shakespeare, I think. Shakespeare is the other thing that I do. I direct Shakespeare plays, and I have a very strong background in theater that is really at the core of so much of what I know about storytelling. And in fact, going back to that idea of sort of knowing what the ending is before you start, I feel like directing Shakespeare plays where, you know, it's not a surprise when you get to the end of Hamlet what happens. You know it's going to be a bloodbath at the end of Hamlet. But the important thing as a director is to make the story feel new, even though the ending is not a surprise. So theater was very important, and The Tempest has been kind of rattling around in my brain for a long time. So I think I'm going to write about The Tempest. Oops, okay. Let's see. Hang on, I'm going to click on the questions here. It looks like Lee got cut off. Can everyone still see me? Okay. Oh, people are asking about, was it difficult to find a voice and vocabulary that sounded ancient but was still understandable for a modern reader? So yes, it was. It took me 5 years. The first 5 years of my novel were just me trying to find Circe's voice and making sure that I could sort of find a voice that felt really authentic for her. I never want to be reaching for a voice or like scrabbling to try to get it. I always want that voice to just flow as if Circe is speaking right into my ear. And so I had no idea what I was looking for. I sort of liken it to a musician tuning an instrument. I feel like I was like, this way, nope, this way, nope, that's not it. And finally what happened was that I got the sort of the beginning. I got the first chapter, and that really laid down this foundation. And suddenly I kind of had the whole thing. But that was 5 years into a very, very messy process. And I think part of what I was looking for was a voice that combined a real directness and honesty, which was a key part of Circe's character, also with this kind of archaic strangeness, alien quality. Oh, Lee, are you back? Oh, hello?
Oh no.
Okay. All right, I'm going to keep going. Lee, I'm so sorry I can't hear you. Oh, interesting. Okay.
A little for both of us.
What'd you say? Oh, okay. So someone has asked, can you comment on Circe's decision to withhold her stories from Odysseus? So one of the things that was important to me as I was thinking about her relationship with Odysseus is the fact that Circe and Odysseus really are in each other's lives at a very specific moment in time. And she knows him for this year when she is in a very, very vulnerable place. She has been through some very intense things. She's feeling a lot of disconnection, and she doesn't really want to be vulnerable to him. And so she decides to sort of take on this role that I think happens actually a fair amount with women, where women sort of don't tell their own stories. They focus on the other person, and you know, that's a way of caretaking, but it's also a way of not actually having to live with what you might be thinking about. And not actually having to dig into stuff that you're hiding. That sort of busyness of caring for someone else allows you to, you know, ignore something that's going on subterranean in your own life. And so I think for me, that's what Circe is really doing in that moment. That she is, there's a lot going on, and she chooses to reach for this caregiving as opposed to facing what's going on with her. But eventually that allows her to transition out of that she rejects that. Hello, Lee.
I thought I would change rooms for you and see if the computer will look here. So thanks for attending the house tour.
No problem. I had a question, so it's...
Go ahead. And I know Katrina is going to pop back on in a moment. Is there another question? Again, you've been able to scroll through it while I was running from room to room. Is there another last question you would like to answer, Madeline, before Katrina rejoins us?
Sure. This is one about Song of Achilles, and I feel like I can answer this because here's Lee, and so Lee can talk about it. This is someone asking about, as a Latin teacher, and hooray, thank you for being a Latin teacher, saying that, did I get pushback from people who believe that the two men were just close friends, Achilles and Patroclus, as opposed to making them lovers? I really thought that I was going to get a lot more pushback than I did. I got very, very little pushback, particularly from classicists, which was nice. I was so scared to tell my mentor that I had written this novel, not because they were gay, but just because I was writing back to the Iliad. I thought it was this incredibly blasphemous thing that I was doing. And so I finally sent the book to him, totally anxious about how he was going to reply. And I called him up and I said, so I've sent you my novel. It is about Achilles and Patroclus. And he sort of jumped in and he said, well, I certainly hope you made them lovers. And I said, oh, I did. I think you're going to like it. And he did. So, you know, I think it's, but I talked about sort of my rage spurring me to write both of these novels. And with Song of Achilles, it was really the fact that I feel like their relationship had been largely whitewashed out. You know, when I read the Iliad in high school, I was like, I feel like something's missing here. I feel like there's something I'm not getting. I don't know. I'm reading this commentary. Like, what's going on with this Patroclus thing? It seems pretty important, but no one's really talking about it. And then when I got to college, and I was reading it more carefully, all of a sudden I thought, oh my gosh, of course people interpreted them as lovers. You know, and here's Plato talking about them not only as lovers, but as ideal lovers. And, you know, there were lost tragedies about Achilles mourning over Patroclus's body and talking about their frequent kisses. And all of this stuff suddenly starts making sense. And when I read the Iliad now, the Iliad makes sense to me. And I felt so angry that that had been sort of pushed aside and ignored and silenced and written out. Because although I think you could write a version of the Iliad that doesn't interpret them that way, that interpretation of them as lovers was so well established in the ancient world, and it should be equally well established today as a possibility. So, you know, I think the people who tend to object to it are not the classicists because they know. It's the people who maybe are not coming from a classical background, who think that I'm, somehow shoehorning this in. Like it's there, I took it from Plato. I don't know what else to tell you. So thank you for teaching it and for bringing that to your students that way, and for standing up for that interpretation. I feel like it's really important.
And do you have other books that you like to recommend to people who have read Song of Achilles and Circe, whether this is for, tell them to get the Dollairs for their children, or the George O'Connor graphic novels, or for the adults who have just read your books? Where do you tell them to go next?
So I have a couple things. First of all, Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey is dynamite. I think it is so great, and it really deals with a lot of issues of social justice and classics, but also it's just amazing. It's really exciting, and it's exciting the way the ancient epics are exciting. And as I was reading it for the first time, I remember having this feeling of like, is Odysseus gonna make it? And I was like, oh, she got me. She really did. So it's a very skillfully done translation, and her pre-note in front of it, her sort of translator's note, and her forward are also both excellent. I love Anne Carson's translation of Sappho, called If Not Winter, one of my absolute favorites. So beautiful. Helen Morales just published, she's a professor, published a book called Antigone Rising that I think is tremendous. I really like Camila Shamsi's Home Fire, which is a retelling of also Antigone. There is a play by a playwright, Madeline George, called Hurricane Diane. That's a retelling of the Bacchae that completely blew my mind when I read it. So if you ever get a chance to see it, I highly recommend. So there's so many writers out there who are interacting with this. I don't know if any of you have read Tayari Jones' An American Marriage. Have any of you read that? That is actually inspired by the Odyssey. It's sort of, except instead of the sort of mechanism of separating a husband and wife for 20 years or for this long period of time, instead of it being war, it is wrongful incarceration. And so she was absolutely inspired by the Odyssey. So once you start looking at classics, you see it everywhere. And there are so many interesting, wonderful works that are tackling it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I know Katrina was going to pop on, but I feel like we might be having, there she is. I was going to say we might be having technical difficulties. But Madeline, I thank you so much for having this conversation. I could talk about these two books all night long. And I've loved getting the refresher of going back into both of them with you. And Katrina, thank you so much for having us both and giving us a chance to talk about Circe and Achilles and the Tempest and everything else that's going to come next.
I think the thanks needs to come to both of you. You were, it was a great discussion tonight. I have been waiting for this talk for the whole festival and beyond, since I've read Song of Achilles and also Circe in April last year. And I've been dying for this talk, and I'm sure everybody else has as well. It's been a brilliant discussion. Thank you so much, Madeline. Thank you so much, Lee. Thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. And I always feel like all of Lee's other books are kind of my book siblings. So I have a new book sibling coming out very soon called Pizza Girl, which Lee edited. So I highly recommend.
Thank you.
I will write the recommendations, Gwen, in the list. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you both. Bye. So I just wanted to finish up by talking about our upcoming events, and to also thank all the festival sponsors and the event partners who've been helping us put on these events, and obviously the festival as well. Thank you so much. And if you'd like to see our other events, you'll see them scrolling around on the screen in a bit. We have a couple of free events coming up over the next 2 weeks. What is Colour? On June the 10th at 7:30, and How to Raise a Reader with Maria Russo on June 17th. And then we have another ticketed event on June the 25th for $10, and that is with John Sayles and Joe Morton. And just a reminder that any proceeds all proceeds, I should say, from the events go towards funding Succeed Together's summer program, which is a 4-week free summer program for low-income students in Essex County. So thank you everyone for coming this evening. I will check out the comments in a few minutes to tell you how to access the replay if you missed part of the talk tonight, and if you want to watch it again. And on that note, thank you so much for coming, and good night.